Hi, Tony.
Hi, everybody.
Hey, Tony.
Tony. Steve's here.
Oh, good. Hi, Richard. And Marcy. Catherine.
Hi, Tony.
Hi,
Hope you're
Sarah.
well.
Okay. Shall we call? Okay, we'll call the meeting to order. I'll start with my script. Good afternoon, everyone. This is President Tony Estremera. Welcome to our teleconference ring central meeting, and thank you for joining us. Before we get started, I wanted to provide a reminder on how we're handling public comment for these remote meetings. If you wish to provide remote telephonic public comment, please make sure that you email Claudia Rodriguez by 2:15 p.m. Please make sure that you indicate the agenda item that you wish to speak about and your name or telephone number in your request so the staff can unmute your line when it is time to provide your comment. As we move through the agenda, Ms. Rodriguez will call out each speaker, unmute their line, and allow them 3 minutes to provide comments. We are also expecting written comments, and all written comments should be emailed to Ms. Rodriguez before the conclusion of the meeting. They will be included in the record of this meeting. Thank you very much. We'll move right along then to a roll call, please.
Good afternoon. Director Samara?
Thank you, Claudia. Yes, here.
Director Atwater?
Present.
Director Palmer?
Here.
Director Blois?
I'm here.
Excellent. We have a quorum.
Great. Thank you all. We'll move right along to the pledge this afternoon. Please join me on the pledge.
If we stand up, everybody can see if we have pants or not.
That's okay. That's why we got to wear them. Just for this meeting. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the
United States of America.
And
to the republic
Republic,
for which it stands,
one nation,
nation,
God.
God, indivisible,
with liberty,
liberty,
justice for all.
for all. Great, thank you. At this time, it's now time for public comment. Any members of the public that wish to address us on any issue not on the agenda, now's the time to do so. And as I mentioned previously, please let Ms. Rodriguez know so that she will unmute you and allow you to make comments to us. All comments are welcome. Now's the time. Ms. Rodriguez, you have any comments yet?
Director Samara, at this time, we have not received any public comments via email.
Okay, so then we'll move right along to approval of the minutes of April 16th. Any discussion? Questions? I'll entertain a motion.
Director Blois moves approval of the minutes.
Second,
Motion and second. Can we have a roll call, please?
Director Samara?
Aye.
Director Atwater?
Aye.
Director Palmer?
aye.
Director Blois?
Aye.
Ayes have it.
Thank you. So that's approved. We don't have anything on the consent. Oh yeah, we do have the Joint Exercise Powers Agreement Amendment number 2 under consent. I'll entertain a motion.
I move.
Is there a second?
I'll second it, Rich Atwater.
Motion and second for the consent calendar. Could we have a roll call, please?
Director Samara?
Aye.
Director Atwater?
Aye.
Director Palmer?
Aye.
Director Blois?
Aye.
All right.
Thank you. Approved unanimously. We'll move right along then to our discussion items, and we'll start with 7A, Stakeholder Engagement Committee update.
Sorry, I just need to unmute myself. Hi, everybody. Hope everyone is in good health. We had our meeting on April 22nd. It was, there was a lot of contention before the meeting. As I think many of you know, we had a lot of letters from both within the SEC as well as outside groups asking for a pause in and or the DCA in general or the SEC. So, you know, we said this at the last board meeting as well, that it would be left up to the SEC to determine whether or not they wanted to continue. So we held our April 22nd meeting. The SEC kind of just decided to take this issue head on right at the beginning rather than after the presentation, and had a discussion about some of their concerns around outreach, some of their concerns about being able to tour the facility sightings, which is something we discussed prior to the stay-at-home orders. But based on their discussion, they ultimately decided to move ahead with the meetings. So our next meeting will be May 27th. We have a few things on our agenda item. I'll be presenting as well some of our thoughts around how to do a tour in the current environment that I think will be good and will allow everyone to kind of get a sort of very good visual and geographic context of our facility siting. We took a look at one thing folks have been asked about. The DCA highlighted how feedback from the SEC has been incorporated into some of the siting concepts that we had presented. So we'd worked with some folks, you know, one example, just Staten Island, there was a shaft that Sean Worth, who's our terrestrial creatures expert, said, you know, I've got real issues with this, and working with him, we were able to move the shaft. So I think it's good. I think people are starting to see how some of their input is being incorporated, though I think a lot of folks have asked to see more of that, to see how their input is going to get incorporated in future materials. Last meeting was our last presentation of facilities with Southern Delta Complex, what features would be featured there. And then the other thing is that what you'll see after I speak, we have asked, I think from the first or second meeting, there was always the expectation that the SEC themselves would present to the board their thoughts on both the process as well as the information that they're getting and providing and how it's going. So this week we'll present the first time that the SEC themselves will present to the board, which I'm really happy about. I think for one thing, it'll kind of, I don't know if placate's the right word, but I think folks have said, look, you're not representing all the thoughts and feelings, which is true. I tend to be very straight to say, we had a meeting, things were discussed, we go forward, and sometimes think I'm doing that in too positive a tone or too negative. So I think it's always great to hear from different viewpoints, and so it'll be a great counter. So I'll introduce our SEC members. The SEC, we thought, folks would do one at a time, but I think the SEC decided to create essentially an ad hoc committee every month of 3 or 4 folks, and to have as a group present their findings. So you'll be hearing from everybody. The other outreach I want to talk about is that we did a presentation to Congressman Garamendi's staff regarding, Congressman Garamendi has long proposed a plan for Delta Conveyance that utilizes West Sacramento Port and the Deep Ship Channel. So our team did a presentation along with DWR to Garamendi's team on sort of their preliminary findings around that plan. So we were able to share that plan, and we'll actually share that with the SEC. I shared it with some of the SEC members, but it's up on the DWR website as well. So that is it. You can take a look at, obviously, our meeting report that has more specifics on some of the information that went back and forth. But my big thing to report is that we are, for the time being, moving forward, working with members to make sure that they are able to connect, sending materials, sending computers as needed, sending Wi-Fi's, because we did have an issue with 3 or 4 folks on connectivity. And we'll move forward. As always, we sort of will reassess at every meeting what works, what doesn't, and figure out how to go from there. On that note, I would like to introduce our SEC members who are on this call. It'll be Mike Moran, Mr. Jim Wallace, Karen Mann, and Lindsay Liebig. Lindsay, did I say your name right? I realize I've never said that out loud. and I will let them take it from here on their presentation.
You did. Thank you, Nasli. I know that happened.
Sorry to interrupt, actually. So Director Stamera, I think this is your opportunity to ask if there's any questions.
Yes, thank you. Thank you. Good afternoon to the committee members. Thanks for coming by. Any questions from the directors? Director Palmer? Director Atwater?
I did have something to say in terms of just being on the, SEC, it's really good to see the folks. I mean, there was some very vigorous discussion, and both positive and negative, and I think Nasli has done a fine job in terms of really working to present it, and I'm very glad to see, although sometimes you stand back with a little bit of, okay, what are they going to say now? But still, nonetheless, folks, it's so important, and I'm really happy to see this this presentation.
Yes, same here. Let me just take a minute to ask if the committee vice chair is present. Director Keegan?
Yes.
She is? Director
yes.
Keegan, any comments?
Yes, I am here, and I would like to also chime in with what Vice Chair Palmer said, or actually Chair Palmer of the SEC.
Yes.
There was very spirited discussion, and it wasn't, all sweetness and light, but I think that that's how we have real dialogues. That's how we are able to get some real honest feedback from people, and it can sometimes be challenging to go through this, but I think ultimately we're going to have a good outcome from having the opportunity to really engage on a level. So I really look forward to hearing the representatives here today share their thoughts about the experience, and very much look forward to that. Thank you.
Thank you, Vice Chair. Okay, we'll move right along then. We'll have the committee members then present.
Jim, would you like to start?
Yeah, thanks, Catherine. And thanks to Director Estamera and to Director Palmer and Keegan for their leadership on the SEC. Appreciate it. I also want to acknowledge that Catherine and her staff have always done a really great job of presenting the data, as has Carrie Buckman and the DWR staff. So the way we're going to do this today is I'm going to present for a few minutes, and then Lindsay, Karen, and Mike will present after me. We're kind of going to concentrate on our stakeholders and the kinds of comments we've received and our impressions of the SEC to this point in time. I represent heritage and history stakeholders, and that's a very large stakeholder constituency. But it's important. It gave me a lot of latitude, by the way, when I was trying to figure out what to present today. Very briefly, look, I live in the Delta. And by no fault of my own, I have two grandsons who are 7th generation here in Cortland. So we got a long history here in the Delta. Today, what I'd want to do is make my presentation in two parts. One is my observations of the SEC meetings and how those SEC presentations were interpreted by the history and heritage stakeholders. And so I'm going to try to distill their views and opinions, but I'm not going to review every DCA presentation. I'm not going to review SEC member responses or comments. And then my second part of my presentation really will be suggestions to improve the stakeholder engagement process moving forward. I don't mean to be presumptuous, but I think that maybe we can improve the way the SEC functions a little bit. But first, what I want to do is make a distinction between history and heritage, since that difference ultimately informs how stakeholders respond to the SEC process. So, for history, Delta indigenous human population traces back thousands of years, and the relevance and importance of that enduring history really should be left to the SEC tribal members to tell their story only as they can. So from a perspective of today's Delta residents, history traces back to the mid-19th century and the origins of the estuary's transformation to a highly man-made environment. And in the last 50 years, Delta history is also intrinsically linked to the robust opposition of any through Delta conveyance, including the currently proposed project. So that's the history baseline, if you like. It's a shared experience, right? And it's one that Delta shares with the entire state. Heritage, on the other hand, identifies perceived value of historic, cultural, natural resources, which have combined to form a landscape. And the perception of that landscape varies from person to person. But importantly, in 2019, Congress established the Sacramento-San Joaquin Delta National Heritage Area, which helped provide focus for a broader concept of the Delta as a nationally important natural and man-made landscape. So that defines the Delta as a place. So moving on to my observations, I think you have to start with my observations as my understanding, and I say mine, I try to interpret what stakeholders have said to me, and obviously it's largely influenced by my perception since I've sat through all the meetings. But my understanding of the purpose of the engagement committee is for the Delta stakeholders to be presented with details of the conveyance design and construction process so that as informed stakeholders, we can provide meaningful recommendations that could improve the way that the project benefits the Delta. So if I've characterized that correctly, that means that the SCC process carries tremendous expectations, not only for stakeholders, but for the DCA. So to meet those expectations, I know that the DCA took a lot of time to find a way to create a diversified SCC. And although that process has been criticized occasionally, I think that is, and I know it's not perfect, I think that the SEC members that have been chosen have always been fully engaged. They've been thoughtful. Sometimes they've been skeptical, and sometimes we've been frustrated. I think I'd probably say that for the DCA as well. But I think we have a solid, good representation of stakeholders in the Delta. And I think that the DCA and DWR staff have always responded professionally to our questions and our occasional skepticism. And one of the things that they've done that I think has helped tremendously has been to offer meetings outside of the SEC meetings, that is field trips, for people who may not get the chance to traverse through the Delta as often as I do, to go out and look at the topography and the geomorphology. Many times during these presentations by DCA, they provided great granular details about specific project elements, which have led to nuanced understanding of the project and typically to more SEC in-depth questions. The presentation has always been, so I thought, geared to soliciting input for facility siting and construction operations. And I think the DCA anticipated that SEC contributions and suggestions to design and construction would be forthcoming. But asking SEC members to make recommendations for moving a project element like a shaft or choosing between intake locations really creates an almost untenable choice for Delta stakeholders. After all, these are our neighbors, our friends, our relatives, and this is the habitat that surrounds us. So that kind of request is difficult. I think it carries certain risks for stakeholders. But during the DCA process, there is not much way for the SEC to identify benefits from this project. I mean, whatever changes the conveyance project might imprint on the Delta, those changes have not been seen as beneficial. And as pointed out by Delta residents, historically, changes in the Delta have happened organically. For instance, changing from paddle wheelers coming up the rivers and sloughs to trains to paved highways, from ferries to bridges, from growing asparagus, tomatoes, and wheat to growing orchards and now to vineyards and wineries. Any induced changes, such as the loss of ag land, more roads, more railroads created by the project, simply should not be claimed as a benefit. So from a global historical perspective, stakeholders I talked to asked a a lot of questions, but one of the ones that struck me was, why are ancient water management practices like river diversions, tunnels, and canals still being proposed as solutions to 21st century problems? So, but I understand that there are limitations to how the DCA could address SEC questions, and we had a narrow scope under which we could make recommendations. The difficulty became differentiating between a project benefit and a mitigation measure, since under CEQA, a mitigation measure is just a way to reduce the significance of an impact. It doesn't create a benefit. Carrie did a good job of always trying to explain that, and I know that has been a certain level of frustration, but trying to identify a benefit from this project for my stakeholder group has been very difficult. And I think the other thing that's been a little difficult is that DCA could not address project operations at the same level of detail that they could address construction and design. After all, how a project is to operate is just as important as where and when, and particularly when it comes to water quality and flood protection. But because Delta heritage perceptions include the entire Delta, and since it's not within the purview of DCA to move the conveyance elements outside of the Delta, ultimately there are no design or construction changes which adequately address the negative impacts of the conveyance project on Delta heritage. And certainly there are no mutual benefits accruing from the project. But maybe there's another process. And that's my second point of this presentation, is maybe there's a way to move this process forward that could we could address some expectations that have been unmet. And the first thing I'd like to recommend, or is just assume that the DCA has completed its SEC presentations, that maybe there's some loose ends to tie up, and then consider this. And this is from an SEC perspective, is just assume or pretend that the conveyance will be approved, financed, and constructed, and that the SEC would pretend, if you will, that the estimated 17-year construction period and all the construction impacts will go forward, and that it really doesn't make much difference for what I'm talking about to identify the exact intake locations or corridor locations or surface access routes, shaft locations or construction area locations. We know what the project is. It's been well presented. So I would like to suggest that we start at a macro project level, and naturally at the micro project effects lead to discussions about project benefits, if there are any. And now the DCA, so we turned the tables a little bit. So now the DCA would be asking SEC and the SEC members for their understanding of the project. And I think this approach would lead to a process which provides DCA with the types of input that lead to change and would not conflict with secret process, and it would not require individual SEC members from capitulating their stakeholder views or options. Of course, this could be a really short conversation, but I think it allows DCA to pointedly ask the SEC, how can or how does this project provide benefits to each stakeholder constituency, and how can or how does this project provide benefits to Delta communities? Not mitigation measures, but benefits. And one last point from the stakeholders, and this has been an issue for stakeholder residents from the beginning of the SEC process. The SEC must be more than a checked box on DCA public participation checklist. The stakeholder engagement must be more than a perfunctory act. So finally, from history and heritage stakeholders, whether the conveyance project is constructed or not, the project's place and all of its predecessors are thoroughly documented in Delta history. But regardless of the outcome, the tunnel's history and cultural value will not become part of the heritage which has defined the Delta as a place. Thanks very much. I appreciate the opportunity to present this to you.
Thanks, Jim, for getting things started. You know, when we met as a group and really got kind of talking about how we wanted to present to the board and really how we wanted to convey kind of what was going on with the stakeholder process, one of the things that just kept coming up over and over again was how responsive the staff has been and the board has been, and really how thankful we are to have this opportunity to even engage at this level, because we have not had that in prior iterations of this project. And so I first want to start off by saying thank you for creating a forum for us to have discussions, whether they, are productive at times or tense at times. We really do appreciate that because I think that's been an outreach effort that we have not had the opportunity to participate in before. Really where I represent is, I serve as the executive director of the Sacramento County Farm Bureau, but I also represent the 4 other Delta Farm Bureaus with our Delta Caucus. So Solano, Contra Costa, San Joaquin, and Yolo, and regularly communicate with those entities and the members within the agricultural industry within those different Delta counties. So when I come from a perspective, it's not just Sacramento County-based agriculture, it's really looking at agriculture in the region as a whole, and kind of where the agricultural stakeholders are feeling, kind of whether it's North Delta, Central, or Southern Delta. I've been very impressed throughout this entire process with the level of detail in the presentation materials that we've had. I've been able to take that back to my groups and actually present more information than they've ever seen before about this project. I know that was one of the greatest criticisms of WaterFix, was that they didn't really understand what the project actually looked like. Things changed up until right before comment periods or hearings. And so they really weren't getting the full breadth of what that project was that they were commenting on. And I don't feel that with this iteration. I feel like I know exactly where all the steps are. I feel like regardless of whether I'm supportive or not supportive, I know exactly what we're looking at, what the footprint's going to be, all of those different construction elements. And that's been very appreciated by those really in this process. And one of the comments that they've made about how things have changed and evolved since previous iterations. It's been a great asset for me to be able to interact with diverse members of the stakeholder committee representing different areas. I am the lone agricultural representative, but ag touches so many of the other areas, whether that's heritage, whether that's some recreation, whether that's environmental. And so really being able to see these people react in a different way of people that, we all interact with the same groups and the same stakeholders. And so it's been I think a well-rounded effort on those, that side, as well as being able to just interact and have those kind of more global discussions. I do want to echo what Jim said, that it is difficult to present feedback in a way that I feel would be as most meaningful to the DCA, because some things do feel like Sophie's choice. Moving from one intake site to the next, I mean, it's like, okay, from my perspective, do I weigh a pear orchard that's been there for decades, or do I put in a new vineyard, or so it's really hard to gauge, what would be a preferential place for removing, 1,000 acres of farmland when I just don't have a good option to give back and feedback. So I've struggled with those elements and really trying to provide some concrete feedback, because I have no real positive things to contribute, in that. From our perspective, removing, 1, 2, 3,000 acres of farmland is not good, and there's not going to be a way to reinvigorate the agricultural economy post-construction with that land being taken. So it's very hard for me, I find, at times, to come with constructive feedback, because everything I'm hearing is no, 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 period. So it's hard in that aspect, I think, to really get some good productive conversations going, because we're just not seeing those mutual benefits from an agricultural perspective. It does feel that sometimes the meetings are a little bit, directed at questions at you versus really the opportunity to engage. And I know we have those Q&A formats, but I feel like our time is sometimes so narrow and limited in what we're talking about that I feel like sometimes we don't get to explore things in a greater capacity or have a greater understanding. And I realize it's because there's such a vast amount of information that we have to go over and make sure that everybody understands that, and we have to keep things on track, fully understand that perspective. But it does feel like sometimes we miss some of the just kind of more open Q&A and kind of thought process type questions that we maybe just need to develop a little bit more if we had some more time to explore some of those elements. I also agree with Jim where the mutual benefits is difficult. It's very difficult to say, because when I ask that question to my groups, they laugh at me. I mean, and I don't mean to put that lightly, but they're like, what is a beneficial part of taking my land out of production? So they're having a hard time coming up with a mutual, beneficial, some elements to even share of what they could use or what would make this, not hurt as bad. It is difficult. I've had a lot of questions about the operation side of things. We do have a lot of growers that are going to be either right around the project in various places, or land that's going to be available to go back into some sort of production post-construction. But without knowing what those operations are going to look like, it's really hard for them to make some of those adequate comments on what would be better or worse, or what they would need, because we have not been able to get into, really into that sector. So the one thing that we're very concerned about it from the agricultural stakeholder perspective is the loss of some of our permanent crops. And what I mean by that is our orchards and our vineyards. It will be easier to turn some of this ground into row crop and more, annual type crops in that perspective, but they are also a lower economic value in some cases. And, and they're going to have different water needs, based on those. Permanent crops is able to give you a better idea of what your water usage is going to be every year. So with taking some of those orchards and vineyards out of production, we're going to definitely lower the agricultural economy. And even if some of that acreage can get moved back into some sort of a row or field crop, it's not going to have that same recovery. And so, what we're seeing is not only the footprint dwindling, but also the economy as a whole dwindling. And additionally, what we're concerned about as well is we're going to see a loss of farm worker jobs in the area because of that. You're going to see farms that are either going to sell out completely, you're going to see things, move and change and that type. And so we're going to see a lot of job loss in the area for our migrant farm worker community, which is a big concern because that's such an economic driver, for the Delta communities. Very concerned about the dewatering aspects and what that's going to look like. Again, looking at more in the construction capacity as far as how long, where, what that's going to look like, what are going to be the implications. My growers do not buy for a second that there's going to be no impacts to agricultural irrigation practices or to even their home domestic wells. So all the science that's been presented that's saying that this is not going to have an impact and this and that, they don't believe that at all. They just cannot fathom that you can dewater down to 190 feet and have that not have an impact on the greater area. So that is something that continues to get brought up. Additionally, the increased traffic and disruptions during the construction process. We are already struggling with those levee roads and doing harvest traffic of those big trucks coming through, and already seeing increased traffic due to apps like Waze and things that are moving people through the Delta to get to Sacramento. And so adding more traffic onto those levee roads that aren't stable to begin with really presents a big issue, and especially comes to pear harvest in the summertime, because it's a precarious driving situation, to begin with. We are looking at ways on some of the areas on how to potentially convert some land into other, crops post-construction. But again, it's very hard to comment on that now because we don't know what the state that land's going to be in. We don't know if it's going to even be viable ground and resources, and those things. Especially with some of those sites that are used for, RTM storage. My growers also don't buy that is going to be safe material that is not going to have any lasting environmental effects on the land that it's being stored upon. So I know the science has been given that, this is going to be able to be used in different things and that, but my growers aren't buying that is going to be a viable material to even use in the Delta, let alone that they're going to want to farm that ground once that material has been stored on there. So that's something that they've been kind of challenging me when I bring those questions back. Really, in moving forward, where I kind of see us going is, I'd like to identify any remaining technical components that need to be presented. What other pieces of this puzzle, have we not discussed yet? But really then moving forward into fostering a discussion more about what stakeholders are hearing and feeling, and how we can address any of those outlying concerns that may not just be construction related. And I get that might be a little bit outside the purview of this committee, and I want to be respectful of the CEQA process, but we're all talking about this on a regular basis, and we're all in meetings with stakeholder groups and really, putting forth, a lot of discussion now in preparations for the CEQA process. And I'm wondering if there's a way that this committee can facilitate some of those discussions in a controlled format, that really kind of looks at the crook of the situation and what can we do to maybe either develop some mutual benefits, address some of these concerns, but that may not be directly, construction related to, the shaft or the forebays, or the intakes. And then also, I think we really need to do a better job at level setting with the SEC about the difference between mutual benefits and mitigation measures. I know based on the secret process, we cannot really get into mitigation, efforts in that, and that'll come later. But I think we're getting sometimes crossed in our own thinking on what could be a proposed mitigation versus a mutual benefit. And I think if we clarified that a little bit, we could have some more productive discussions about what are mutual benefits that we can look at and can discuss that are maybe under DCA's, purview. So I would like to also see continued efforts and outreach with the individual stakeholder groups kind of post the SEC process. I mean, I don't think this committee can exist for forever. And once we kind of get past the life of that, I want to remain engaged because I know that we're going to be directly affected just in a cropland, and loss of acreage that way. And so I want to be able to have those, one-on-one discussions, either with that's the DCA staff or DCA board, or bringing some more of my constituents and things, to the table. So it's not just me kind of being the only voice, but, really looking at some engagement of the individual stakeholder groups post SEC and setting that up so that we keep those conversations going, we keep that line of communication open, and really being able to, have that, open line so that we can ask questions and vice versa, at the DCA. So I appreciate this opportunity, and, at this time, I'll let Karen, pick it up from the business perspective.
Thank you very much. Karen?
Unmute now. Hello. I think I pushed the right button now.
Yeah, we hear you.
Hallelujah. Great. Thank you all so very much for allowing us 4 members this time to speak with you, to share our thoughts. We want to thank the DCA committee and staff for putting together a very interesting program. I've learned more about construction of tunnels and shafts than I ever have, and I appreciate that very much. I've got also many new friends. Personally, Karen Mann, I've been water skiing, boating, fishing, camping, and recreating in the Delta waterways since I was about 9 years old. We won't go into how many years that is. And I've been a business owner for 40 years, a small business owner. I've lived in the Delta for 18 years on the water. So I take this Delta very, very seriously. I'm currently an active member of 3 different boat clubs who utilize the entire Delta waterways to build skills, recreate with our family and friends, and also to end up spending a lot of money on our vessels. I'm currently a delegate for the Pacific Intercoastal Yacht Club, which is a representative to more than 100 yacht clubs, marinas in the Bay, Delta, and Pacific area. Today, I'm here and part of SEC, I am here to represent the business community, which would be affected by the tunnel project for Eastern Contra Costa County. That would include Bethel Island, Byron, Oakley, Knightson, Brentwood, Discovery Bay, and the unincorporated areas. Within those areas, we have all types of businesses, small, medium-sized, some large. Most of us are small business owners, and we depend on the waterways, or somehow the waterways are infiltrated into our businesses. Outdoor recreation contributes $46 billion to the California economy and generates $3.1 billion in annual state tax revenue. That's a lot of jobs, and that's a lot of spending on people who like to recreate in the California Delta. I also spent some time, once I was appointed, and I was really honored to be considered to be on the SEC committee. But once I was appointed, I looked up what a stakeholder engagement committee is all about. And in other industries, the stakeholder engagement committee is provided to inform, consult, and collaborate with the teams. Other SEC groups also want to be sure to keep the stakeholder involved, and that the stakeholders are part of the solution. And that's what I believe that our SEC team is trying to do, is to be a part of the solution. The ultimate goal is for the potential project manager or planners to work with SEC to achieve the best solution for the stakeholders and the project team. So my assessment of what we've actually done, well, the maps have been impressive, dated. All of the maps have been dated. But my overall impression is that if the process was to work with the stakeholders and get collaboration from us so that we could both come up with an agreeable solution, then this was a failure. Each of us on the committee have tried quickly to come up to speed to understand the engineering. The staff has been excellent for trying to explain the engineering to us. When we have concerns about issues or questions about the engineering, staff's been fabulous as far as explaining it to us. But when we have concerns from our stakeholders' points of view, I don't know that we're getting quite the collaboration and the conversation that we really, really need to take back to our stakeholders. Each of us have had a lot of input to the process, but I'm really feeling like window dressing and that my voice and the voice of my SEC partners are not being heard about solutions. The first item, the intakes. As Lindsay mentioned, the intakes, choosing this one over that one over the peach orchard. The intakes are in the same location as the water fix location, in that vicinity, and it's going to adversely affect the legacy community. And that is a huge concern. I don't feel like we've been listened to. I don't believe the legacy community's been listened to. That's a huge concern. Let's start just with that. The water board hearings, the Delta Stewardship Council hearings made it clear that a massive intake simply cannot be located in the Delta legacy communities. That's not from me. That's from the water board hearings and the Delta Stewardship. SEC members have recommended alternative solutions, but that seems to have fallen on deaf ears. It just kind of goes out there. We're told, no, that's not what we're doing. I feel like you've wasted our time with the explanations of the descriptions and locations, which were not approved in the previous water fix. Why are we going back there again? The next item is the Central Corridor route. Well, my hair's standing up straight for a reason, and that's because the Central Corridor route. What part of no does this group not understand? Your own hand-picked recent engineering peer review team said the Central Corridor is not feasible. There's no benefits to the East Contra Costa County. It will adversely affect our wells. I've had conversations, and I have a write-up from the Discovery Bay town manager with his concern about the wells. And then the route through the center will affect the wintering grounds for the waterfall, including the sandhill cranes. And it will go through a center of heavily used recreation area and the National Heritage Area. So this is not a good choice. This seems to be the only choice that we're given to look at these days. And so needless to say, my concern about this. As a representative of the businesses in the Southeastern Delta in the Delta Corridor, the presence of the Central Corridor route would disseminate and destroy the businesses, recreation, sandhill crane nesting area, and recreation which we've become accustomed to for the last 75 years. If the intent of this plan is to proceed to condemn and take the entire communities, then okay, be honest with us so that we can make other plans for our businesses and our homes. But that's certainly not what we intended on this. I noticed in your board packet today, the real estate acquisition plan will commence. That's an area I'm extremely familiar with. Based on what we've been told, the route has not yet been finalized. So I don't understand why the real estate acquisition plan is moving forward unless you've already identified the route that it's going to be. At this point, I don't know if any route is possible, but the central route is certainly not. Finally, I've got copies of statements written by the general manager of Discovery Bay and the fire marshal who represents the Eastern Contra Costa County Fire District about the adverse impacts to the Discovery Bay and Byron businesses, residents, and the infrastructure, which would be put into jeopardy. We're talking about 25,000 to 50,000 people and their businesses. It's a lot of people. According to the Central Corridor Plan and the layout for the Byron Maintenance Shaft, that shaft will be within 1,000 linear feet from single-family residences, homes, where people have their children, their grandchildren. That's where they have their livelihood. The fire marshal was shocked and outraged he had not been consulted early on in the planning so that he could address the severe consequences of the ingress and egress of the truck traffic and just the lack of fire stations that he has available. We have 3 fire stations. Your maps show that we have 9. 3 fire stations to cover 250,000 square miles is really, it's pretty tough. So 250 square miles, excuse me, too many zeros. So their concern is for the health and safety of the residents. I, like the others, I'm looking for the benefit. I really like to look for the gold at the end of the rainbow. I'm not seeing the benefit yet to those of us who live and recreate and work in the Delta community. And I know that you've got altruistic ideas. You want to make this work. It's got to be a win-win for everybody. And what I'm looking at right here is it's a lose-lose for anybody that lives in or on the Delta area. Thank you very much. Now Mike will be able to share.
Thanks, Karen. Thanks, everybody. I'm Mike Moran, work at the East Bay Regional Park District over at the Big Break Visitor Center, the Delta. I'm supervising naturalists there. And like everybody else, I want to begin with a great big thank you for everybody involved in this process, the DCA board, all the folks working with the DCA, the committee, working with the Stakeholder Engagement Committee and the staff. Been nothing but incredibly professional and gracious and kind. And that really goes a long way, making this a beneficial process. Thank you. And to the SEC members, I have learned a lot and met a lot of fascinating, smart, wonderful people. And although I've been working out here in the Delta for 25 years, I'm just learning an awful lot about the place. I'm an ex officio member and in the recreation realm, and I'm representing East Bay Regional Park District. The Park District does not have an opinion either way. There's no stance on this project, although we did submit a letter when the NOP was released, and that's on record with you folks. When I was beginning to think about what to say in all this is why did I even join this process? And the fact that I've been working out here for 25 years, and when I was in my graduate studies, I studied the salmon fisheries in the San Joaquin Basin, and I've been fascinated in studying water in California, the Delta, for pushing 40 years now. And I knew that there's always a bump in the process, at least a bump. And I saw this as something parallel to the way I approach these issues, and that this was getting folks involved, disparate parties, disagreeing parties, involved early on in the process before the official CEQA process. And I took great hope in that, and I still do. On my application, I wrote that our value in parks and recreation is to interpret the many stories of the Delta and its stakeholders, local and distant, honestly, accurately, and effectively. And as an interpreter, I advocate for information, understanding, empathy, which is probably my biggest word that I carry through this whole process, and connection. And that translates to credibility and trust across the stakeholder spectrum. And I think that this process has been very positive, and that it begins to get at what's been missing all along in water issues, especially through the Delta, and that is that sense of empathy and connection. That there's been a lot of antagonism historical, everybody knows that, but this takes a step towards trying to do something a little bit differently, and I've really appreciated that. And the team, everybody involved, has been so much information, so well presented, so professionally presented. It's of such high quality. It's been very impressive. The attitude I think that folks have been taking has been very transparent and sincere. And if I come away with that, I feel like there's a trust built that even if I don't agree with the information, that I know it's coming from a sincere spot. Folks have been, as I mentioned before, very responsive and patient. And although folks have been disagreeing with particular presentations, and some have gotten a little more spicy than others, The overall feel has been very respectful, very professional, and very friendly. And I really deeply appreciate that. So the process has been very positive. I think it's a great step that everybody's been taking, and it's an exciting step. The purpose, so as I've been thinking about this, is really what is the purpose of this? What does a productive, applicable, and successful, ultimately successful SEC look like to the DCA? And are we doing that? Is that actually happening in this process? And it would be just nice to know if we've been going through things perfectly according to the plan, or is there something that we should probably switch tracks on a little bit? The feedback has not just been recorded and acknowledged. The question and answer logs are just fantastic. But it was nice to hear Nasli mention today about the Deepwater Channel study, and also mentioning earlier on, you mentioned Sean and the repositioning of one of the shafts over on Staten. Those are really valuable. I think that if there's any way that we could really up the real tangible ways that the SEC is applying to this project, and the opinions and thoughts and ideas expressed are actually being applied to the project every time we meet, every report, is really valuable. And if we could really increase that, even if it seems minimal, that will get buy-in from people. I think that goes a long way towards that empathetic approach. I mentioned a few times during the meetings the Frank's Tracked Futures project, which I'm also involved with. And that's one of the reasons why I joined the SEC, because I thought that here are two big projects happening in the Delta that are taking a new approach, and a very, an approach that has responded to previously unsuccessful approaches, and to try to do something different, not just massage around the edges, but really try to do something different. And even with that, though, my SEC engagement, when I talk to folks in mostly Eastern Contra Costa County here, and when I begin to speak of this project, I always have to back up a step and to give context. Why is this project being built? There's the assumption of this board, of this committee, is that the DCA is going to be built. So if that's a given, how can we best go forward by providing any kind of mutual benefit or minimizing impacts along the way? And I think that as soon as we say that this is, assuming this is going forward, and it does have great value to say that, it changes mindsets. When I engage the public, as soon as I say that things being built, it brings out the same parties with the same entrenched positions, and that we're all familiar with over the years. And that was really evidenced in some of the scoping hearings that I felt like the DCA folks, Carrie and her team, didn't really have a chance to present or talk back to and answer some of the concerns at those particular hearings. And I think people are really hungry for that, to have a direct addressing of their concerns. If you don't get that, you don't feel like you're being listened to. Even if you are being listened to, you don't get that evidence and feeling for that. So having some way to push that forward is really beneficial too. I really think we're on our way with this process. We have a great opportunity to not only bring out people who have been in these battles for the last decades, but also to broaden that audience and really begin this foundational understanding of how do we even get here? How do we get to a point where we need to do this? Because that is the overarching feeling that I'm getting from stakeholders, is that the understanding of the complexities is just missing. And if you throw on top of that without a foundation, and you throw on top the very detailed engineering reports and map locations and things like that, there's no context into which to fit that. And so our job here has been to back up a step and actually put that context into place. I think there's an opportunity for the SEC and the DCA to actually set that out somehow as a preliminary step, to not only say, describe the project, well, we need to do this because it's going to be more reliable water deliveries and it's meeting this particular requirement and that particular requirement, but actually figure out a way to tell folks why it's doing that and why is that a concern? How do we get to this particular spot? This is my bias. This is what we do here at Big Break. And we found it to be very valuable to be able to ask and answer the question from each side. Is that somebody says, why would they think about doing that? Why would you want to do something like that? And to be able to answer that. And if somebody says, why would you ever even think about doing it? Or why would you not have this thing done by now? Answer that question. Be able to really explain this thing instead of sell this thing, explain this thing on a much grander context to begin. It does involve a lot of lifting. It's interpretation and the history and the context and the impacts and the trajectory. What are we looking towards and why do we have such divergent opinions here? And I think that's the good work that needs to be done in any big project, any project at all, but also in water projects. How do we actually represent those views and say that these views have been considered from folks who are locals, from stakeholders who live hundreds of miles away? And I think that this is a really good forum to do that. That's just one step that I feel that we could do better. And that would give me a heads up or a head start in actually explaining what the project is to already have folks understand why on earth we're doing it. I've been calling this kind of a pre-CEQA process or a format. And I think that the SEC could really be very beneficial. The voices that I've heard on advising on a path forward that assuming that the project happens, instead of what could we do to move a shaft, but what will the stakeholders want? What would they really want? What would that, Jim was using a term Delta character, which had a huge impact on me, big impression, to expand beyond those mutual facilities benefits, to go beyond in situ mitigations and move the road this way, move the road that way, take it out, leave it in, but to really how best, while doing this project, can you maintain, restore, or even improve Delta character? And to do that, you need to have an engaged community that can help present the many facets of that character. And those benefits, I think, should be immediate, mid-range, long-term, and continuous benefits. Folks here understand that this might be a 50-year project, an infrastructure project lasting for 50 years. Folks who are going to be getting water from this project will be getting continuous benefits. What will the continuous benefits for the folks in the Delta be? Beyond just the mitigation and removing roads, as the character has been changed. And perhaps that's best done with some kind of a commission or ombudsperson going forward, something that keeps those ideas and resources from the local stakeholders going forth, the decision makers, and shifting away from that mitigation and really figuring out how does this benefit folks from continued input. And I think continued is really the big key. How do we continue expanding that outreach and education and benefit throughout the lifespan of this project? My big take is that this has been a wonderful change in the way that these projects have been put forth. It's not perfect, but it is a huge improvement on what I've studied and been involved with in the past. And I consider it incredibly hopeful, if not for the completion of the project, but as a process, as a template going forward. And I think that education and outreach and engagement are key components that must go on as long as this project does. Thank you.
Thank you so
I think
much.
that was the last presentation.
Great. Well, thank each and every one of you. Let me just name you again so that the folks that are listening remember. Many of us took notes, and I'm sure many of the public members took notes, just so that Mr. Jim Wallace, Ms. Lindsay Liebig, Mr. Mike Moran, and Ms. Karen Mann. Thank you all so much. This is the reason why I wanted this committee, and I tell you, right away, there's an immediate improvement by having you directly communicate with us and the public as members of the committee. So thank you. I'll move right along and ask for comments, and I'll start, of course, with Chair Palmer.
I was very interested in hearing this. Having you guys, the SEC members, come in and actually voice your concerns, both positive and negative. It's stuff that is eye-opening for all of us. It's important for us all to consider this. I was, so it touches me to hear people say that this is a Sophie's choice type of a thing. It's and it's important for us to know that feeling exists and is very real. And looking at the idea of especially with Mike, and looking at the idea of why are you doing this? I mean, I'm an educator originally, and that being able to explain why, I do think we need to do we need to work on doing a really good job on that. And I know that our staff has been incredible, but the technical we're all very technically oriented, but we do have to do that why. And I agree with you. And thank you so much to the four of you for coming in and voicing both your personal and opinions that you've gotten from the people that you've been listening to. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Sarah. Let me quickly go to the vice chair of the committee, Ms. Keegan.
Thank you, Mr. Estremera. It's great to hear directly from the people on the committee, and I want to thank all the kind comments. And I also want to thank the comments that were a little on the critical side, because that's how we move forward. That's how we get information. I think that one thing that I've really appreciated in participating with this process is not only has staff been professional, I feel like the SEC members have been very professional as well. And I think that they've provided really important input. And, I'm glad to be part of something that's a change from how we handled things in the past, because I don't think the way we did it in the past is consistent with what the expectations are of the public right now. This isn't 100 years ago where you just go out with bulldozers and do a project and don't think about the impacts to the community. And, Mike, your comment about the Delta character, I think that's really important, and it's something that I think a lot about. I'm a recreational boater. I've been going to the Delta for many years. My sister's in-laws are business and property owners in Rio Vista. And so there is a special character to the Delta, and it's part of the history and the heritage and the recreational opportunities. And to the extent that we're able to get input from those who are going to be impacted by the project, so that we can, to the greatest extent possible, protect that environment and protect folks, I think is really important. And it's very exciting. I'm very proud to be part of this process. I appreciate having the opportunity to work with Ms. Palmer and with Catherine and the rest of the team. I think this is something at the end of the day, we're all going to be able to look back on and feel very proud of our participation. So thank you again to the SEC members who showed up today. And I look forward to hearing from some of the other members at future meetings. So thank you.
Thank you, Vice Chair. Director Atwater?
Yeah, I really want to thank first Sarah and Barbara for doing a wonderful job and participating in the SEC. And for the dialogue today, I think it's very insightful. It's the kind of process that you need to have, is frank conversation. It's the only way we can make progress. And so I'm really pleased with how this has moved forward with the SEC over the last, 4 or 5 months. And don't want to repeat the comments that Sarah and Barbara did. They've really shown a lot of great leadership on this, Tony. And I think we got to continue the engagement and obviously listen and participate as much as we can, so we understand how we can work together to move forward. Thank you.
Thank you, Richard. Director Blois?
Thank you, Chair Estremera. I too echo the comments of my colleagues. Very, very gratified and pleased to realize the extent of the participation and the sincerity of the participants. We all recognize that we're not going to agree on everything, but we also have a job to do. And our job is to come up with the absolute best project we can that works not only for us, but for everybody. We want to come up with a project that works well for all of the people that have spoken and everybody else, the Delta interests. But it also has to recognize that it has to work for the people of the state of California. To the extent that we get sincere and honest input, that will help us in our mission. And I really, really look forward to continuing that process in a absolutely sincere way. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Steve. We do have a public comment, so I'll call that now from Ms. Osha Meserve. Ms. Meserve?
Hi, can you hear me?
We
Yes.
Well,
Good
hallelujah.
afternoon.
I tried a different way this time. I can even, well, I don't know. Yeah, I can't. I'm trying to undo. I tried to give you my video, but I can't seem to do that. Anyway, we'll leave it at this. Yeah, just a couple quick comments on behalf of local agencies of the North Delta. Appreciate the stakeholders coming in and giving their own report. I think is a great idea. I just wanted to clarify from the engagement committee page of the report. I think that, you know, it's a little bit, I think that we expected coming out of the last board meeting that you guys held that the stakeholders would vote on whether to keep going when we're kind of limited in being able to get out there and meet in person. And, you know, that vote didn't happen on the committee. And I think that the reason why the meeting, it was determined that the meeting would continue with the stakeholders is because I think it was pretty clear from staff at DCA that if the stakeholder group didn't continue, they would not get to have input into the engineering. So it was kind of a rock and a hard place, I think, that the committee was put in, and I think that was unfair. I wanted to also mention that let's see, it's page 5 of the report. It does mention that critical infrastructure, including Delta Conveyance, is proceeding. I just want to make the distinction. There is, according to the governor's exemption from the stay-at-home orders and whatnot, there's such a thing as essential infrastructure. And future water projects are not essential infrastructure. And that's why I believe, you know, the DCA and DWR are complying with, you know, work at home and stuff like that. So I just want to make that distinction. You guys have used the term critical infrastructure, and I don't know what the legal definition of that is, but it's not essential infrastructure. Essential infrastructure is what providing water supplies from current projects today, not future. And I would just say last point is that, the Garamendi stuff, I mean, there was some, I think, wrong information in that PowerPoint provided to him about why the Western Delta couldn't be considered as an alternative in the EIR. I don't know whether I want to advocate for that alternative, but I do think it needs to be considered. I do not think it can be dismissed preliminarily from consideration prior to full review in the EIR, and I'm happy to talk about that with folks, you know, later. And then last, you know, I just think, you know, as much as the stakeholders are putting into this, and I think that if they had broader sideboards about what they were able to provide input on in terms of alternatives and broader ways to meet the objectives that the directors have spoken of that are important to your group, you know, I think more could come out of it. I think with the narrow sideboards and basically giving them an assignment that is about, you know, here's where the project's going to be, tell us how to do it a little better. I think that you're not getting the full value of this excellent group of individuals from the community. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Meserve. Before we move along, I wanted to just take a quick minute to, of course, thank each of the committee members that presented to us this afternoon. But I do want to say this is the very reason why I was adamant about having this committee as a way of having public input, because we're getting public input. And yeah, eventually I think once we all get a pretty close understanding and a more detailed understanding with committee members of the project itself and the construction variables, that we will get to talking about benefits to the community. And personally, that's where I want to get at. That's where I think all of our board members want to get at, because we do want to see a win-win situation. So I think we are following the right direction. We get to know the project a little more intimately, get to understand where the questions are, where the criticism is, and then I think we will get to talking about alternatives, effective alternatives, and especially what's most important, I think, to the community is, as was mentioned initially by Jim Wallace, what exactly are the benefits to the community that we're talking about in the project? And I think that's ultimately really important for us to get to. So I think we're headed that way. And we're headed that way because we have a group of community people that are really committed to making sure that this project is a win-win. So I thank the committee members for coming before us, and I really do enjoy this new approach of having you directly communicate with us and the public at the same time. So thank you. We keep improving our approach, and that's what this is. It was a tremendous improvement. So thank you very much. I've got a lot of notes that I'm going to follow up, both with the CEO and, you know, together with our directors. This creates a lot of opportunity for discussion between us. And I think that, like I said, we're heading in the right direction. And that direction is to get to the win-win situation and what the benefits are going to be mutually to the community. So thanks again. We'll move right along then to our discussion item C, the DCA's transition back to the office. Catherine?
Yeah, I just want to introduce Marcy Scott, who is the head of our HR, who's going to do a real quick presentation on how the DCA plans to move forward in the light of COVID. So Marcy, you want to hop in here?
Great.
Thank
you, Catherine. Hello. Hello, directors and all those who've joined virtually today. As you're probably aware, Governor Newsom has defined a 4-phase plan for gradual reopening of the state. We are currently in phase 2, loosening some restrictions based on specific criteria. In Sacramento County, we're continuing to operate under a general stay-home order from the county's public health officer. That order expires tomorrow. We have not seen the successor order, but we are aware of their variance attestation form that they have sent into the state to request further variance on the restrictions and to continue to relax some of those restrictions. We're also aware that throughout the state, there are some regional differences in terms of the restrictions. And so we continue to monitor all these things as they're changing. But in the meantime, the DCA is continuing to work in a telework status and focusing on our functions as they're defined from the DWR and the timeline. The DCA IT systems were brought online in January, and they have fully supported an immediate pivot to remote work. This pivot occurred right before the sprint to our April deadline. And without skipping a beat, the DCA has continued to meet deliverables to the DCO and continue to provide these materials that we're using in our meetings as were referenced by the SEC members. Board meetings and SEC meetings are continuing virtually with some modifications and some additional equipment provided by DCA. Our regular meeting cadence is continuing. And the DCA at this time will continue to work in a telework status to protect workers, the community, and to reduce our carbon footprint. However, with continuing relaxation of restrictions, we are preparing our Sacramento office to be available for workers to provide this option on a voluntary basis. Our offices were designed as an open concept to maximize collaboration. Our team is currently working on modifications to institute physical spacing of at least 6 feet. And we expect a small number of DCA workers to be interested in the office work. And so we feel we can meet and exceed that requirement. We plan to continue virtual meetings, especially with stakeholders and others outside of the DCA. We're also preparing protocols for behaviors that will be required in the office to maintain a safe work environment. We have sourced PPE, but one of our challenges has been to find large quantities of disinfecting materials. But we're continuing to work on this. And we're in frequent communication with building management to work together on safety measures, starting with the main building entrance. So within a number of weeks, we expect to be able to offer individuals the choice to continue to telework, to work in the office pursuant to the written protocols, or a combination of both. We do not foresee air travel to perform DCA work in Sacramento for the foreseeable future. And we anticipate that we'll continue working in this manner for the foreseeable future. So that's a summary of our current plans. We're happy to answer any questions.
Questions? Okay, thank you. Seeing none, I don't think we have any public comment. Then we'll move right along to D, draft DCA budget for fiscal year 2021.
All right, thank you, Director Estamera. You have in your package our proposed draft budget for next fiscal year. This is the first draft. We plan to come to you with a final version of this for your review and approval at the June board meeting. Overall budget is around 34 million. Just to highlight, yeah, thanks, Claudia. Just to highlight a couple of things, most of the work next year will revolve around the engineering needed to support Carrie's team on the CEQA documentation, and we would like to get the field work going. The field work is important. It's geotech exploration so that we can help, in part, answer some of the questions stakeholders have asked us, for instance, on pile driving and how we plan to dewater sites, and some of the construction issues around stabilization of soft soils. So a lot of this geotech work is really going to help us refine the construction and design of this project, and also help us answer some questions for the community. Karen Mann, I did hear you talk about the fact that we are starting the property management. That's around doing the temporary access to get to these geotechnical locations so that we can do boreholes. There's property managers and temporary permits that are part of that process. We've also budgeted to stakeholder engagement. We plan to continue the monthly engagement with our stakeholder committee, continue to present information and solicit feedback and ideas. And after hearing from the four of you, I'm going to think even harder about how we open up that process more so that it doesn't seem as closed as it may appear. I certainly never intended to be that way. Our budget this year is based on a lot of the costs from last year, but as we know, we live in a whole new world. So one of the things that we're going to be doing is taking a really close look line by line of the items, particularly under the administration area, and try to shift some of those monies into the field work so that we can get additional boreholes and additional field studies together that'll help the engineering. So that if you see some changes between now and then, a lot of that is culling out some money that reflects a change of not working in the office and hosting meetings like this and the stakeholder engagement meetings remotely. it wasn't clear to us when we anticipated some of these measures being lifted, but it seems like we're going to be in this mode for quite some time moving forward. So if you have any questions on the budget, I'd be glad to answer them.
Questions? Director Palmer?
Nope.
Director Atwater?
No, we've
Director
talked to
Blois?
Catherine. It's
I'm
good.
happy with what Catherine's presented.
Great. Okay, thank you. Anything else on this, Catherine?
Nope.
Okay, great. We'll move right along then to E, the May DCA Monthly Report.
Yes, you have a copy of your monthly report in there. Not much has changed since last month. One new item, which is the procurement of the general counsel services permanently. That's been added in there as a new commitment. But other than that, looks very similar to the last month's report. I'm glad to answer any questions you may have.
Thank you. Questions? Okay, there being none, we'll move right along then to 8, staff reports and announcements, and we'll start with the general counsel's report.
Thanks, President Estremera. So my written reports in the packet, there were just 2 things I wanted to highlight. The first was you'll see some references to the stage 2 and reopening, and the fact that, at least according to my report, Sacramento County hadn't submitted the paperwork to the state to start moving through stage 2 more quickly than possible. And of course, based on Ms. Scott's presentation, that's outdated. Just based on when it was prepared. The second item I wanted to just note is, appreciate the board's approval of the JEPA amendment. That was an administrative cleanup, and we're happy to have that. So thank you. Happy to answer any questions.
Thank you. Questions? Questions? Okay, we'll move right along then to the treasurer's report. Good afternoon, Catano. Can't hear you. Claudia, is she muted?
I don't think she's muted. Let me see.
I think she's dealing with children. We can read it.
Oh, there she is. Catano? We can't hear Catano.
Okay, we could come back to it then. We'll move right along to the next report. We'll come back.
Okay.
So environmental managers report. Carrie, good afternoon.
Good afternoon. Thanks for having me. This month, well, really right now we're focused on working on getting the environmental impact report moving. So the environmental scoping period closed on April 17th, and we received quite a few comments, roughly 850 comments. And so we're working to go through those comments, understand that input, and document it in a scoping summary report. So right now we're sorting those comments by topic area, looking at how we want to incorporate them, and documenting that work. So that effort we're expecting to be done probably late June, early July.
Great. Any questions?
Thank you, Carrie.
Thank you, Carrie. We'll move right along then to verbal reports, if any.
This is Rich. I have none.
Yes. Yes. Does somebody have a comment?
No, I just said I have no report. Thank you.
Oh, okay. Okay. All right, no reports. We can go back to the treasurer's report. And as you...
I think we're getting it, but maybe not in a language we understand.
Okay, well, it's noted. So if any questions about it? We seem to have a lot more than the federal government, so. Ooh.
Report, so I think it's.
Katana might be having trouble with her audio, but.
Well, we have a written report, so it's fine.
Yeah.
Like I said, we got a lot more money than the federal government, so I think,
And
I think we're okay this month.
And I wanted to say also, thank you, Katana, for being quite so thorough.
Claudia, can you hear me at all?
Oh, yes, we can.
Oh, there you go.
All right, I am so sorry. So.
No problem. We were just thanking you for your report.
Oh, yes, thank you. The report is included, and
Yes.
in general, we ended up with about $978,000 at the end of April. That is after paying some bills. We received actually about $3.3 million. We paid out 2.4. We ended up with $801,000 at the end of May. So we also included in that an analysis of our payables and actuals, budget versus actual. So I would be happy to take any questions if you have any. Sorry.
Thank you, Katana. And I see that we also paid all of our bills, unlike the federal government.
Yes.
Any questions? Any comments? Great. Well, thank you, Katana.
Okay, I'm sorry. I don't know what happened. I was waiting and.
Oh, no problem. No problem. We're all learning. Don't worry about it. Any future agenda items suggested? Okay, at this time, then we're ready for adjournment. Our next scheduled meeting will be June 18th at 2 p.m. I guess we'll still be virtual. If not, of course, we'll do it at the library or right at our new offices because we haven't used that conference room yet. So we'll see. Anyway, thank you very much. Thank you all for participating today. And we stand adjourned until that next meeting. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye, everybody.
Thank you.